Hello everyone. It's been a while. I hope you're all having a good weekend. And I finally had some time to get back to my model of the U-81. It's been really a long time, so I'm trying to remember what we did last time. I think we ended up having the hull painted with the first coat and having it assembled to the point that, the glue's certainly dried by now. So we can just go ahead and get these removed. The little tape strips that I'm using to hold it in place. And it should all be good by now, so we can continue with attaching some of the smaller parts on the outside. I think the very next stage is going to be the propulsion system. So that's our hull so far. If you can't remember, I've painted the top in a slightly darker blue tone because I'm going to weather that later on. But I'm quite happy so far with the paint and with the level of detail that is still shining through, because you always got to be careful not to overdo it. And what I'm thinking of doing this kind of, I'm not sure if it's grime or rust, but downwards streaks around the side of it. But for now, let's just move on and start putting some of the control planes on and part of the propulsion systems. So first we've got the frontal hydroplanes, which will make the submarine not necessarily go up and down. I mean, that's the ballast, and changing if it's surfacing or diving, but it's still somewhat necessary for changing the direction. Now, these things are called submarines, but in German U-boat or Unterseeboot, really undersea boats, under ocean boats, they were more like submersibles. And I was while I was doing this, I was actually wondering, because the first ones were not having snorkels and couldn't actually operate their diesel engines while submerged, so they were running on batteries. And that was a long time ago. I mean, it's taken us quite a bit to get to the point where something like Tesla runs on batteries, and that's a car. This is a submarine. These things are large. So how strong were these batteries, and how fast were these things actually going? I started trying to look up some information and found surprisingly little on the English internet, but on the on German sites I did find a little bit more. So it looked like the Type VII's had around 2,800 to 3,000 horsepower on their diesel engines, which got them a surface speed of around about 17 to 18 knots as a top speed. So that wouldn't be their cruising speed, that'd be their top speed. So that's probably like one of the early American carriers. These things weren't that quick. And underwater it was even worse, because the battery power, or the electric engines, the battery powered electric engines would do about, I think it was about 300 horsepower or so. So, or maybe 400. It wasn't too much. So these things would actually be relatively slow underwater. Top speed underwater was somewhere around 7 or 8 knots when submerged. Which means that also if these things get chased by something like a destroyer, they had absolutely no way of running away from them, because even if they were surfaced, there was no way they could have outrun any of them. They weren't just that quick, because there's not much space in terms of putting actual engines somewhere. So how long could they sustain underwater? That was my next question, because, these batteries probably weren't all that great yet then. The batteries were actually lead acid batteries, which you would usually think is a bit of a problem because, well, lead's pretty heavy. But for a submarine, that's actually a good thing because, well, they could be used to weigh it down such that, because you want the thing to sink. It's not like on a normal ship where you'd prefer it not to sink. But with these things, you want it to have like an equilibrium in their buoyancy, so it's such that you're able to actually get them to sink, or you fill the tanks to get them back up again. So lead acid batteries they were, and they could do round about 150 kilometers submerged at a speed of 4 knots. If they were going full speed, we're talking about maybe 50 kilometers underwater on battery power. And also, they obviously had problems with it being a little stuffy inside. So They could do, I think as it was said, they could do about 72 hours before everybody died being submerged. And then they had to actually get up and refresh the air a bit. They had some ways of dealing with the carbon dioxide inside the boat, but it was going to get stuffy very, very quickly. Now, the other problem that, while I was researching that, I came across is a much more mundane one. Submarines had somewhere between 40 and 50 sailors on board, and they had a toilet, as in one single toilet. The toilet could only be operated when the submarine was on the surface, because you had to flush the toilet. And this is not something you can do if tons of water are pressing from the outside against the hull. So I haven't been able to find anything on how the Japanese solved this problem, especially with their more long-range submarines. The Americans apparently had certain special kind of boxes that they were able to use. And, the German toilets in the beginning weren't that great either. So later on the war, in typical German fashion, they thought that they could find an engineering solution to this problem to, make the submarines be able to be underwater a lot longer and people actually going to be able to use the loo. So they devised a complex system of valves and tubes to create a high-pressure environment underwater toilet, such that they could flush while the submarine was submerged. The problem then, of course, was that it actually needed a specialist technician to go and operate this said toilet, because it was relatively complicated to do this. And it was even worse. If you got it wrong, you wouldn't flush, whatever you did in the toilet outside the submarine, but you would flush it into the submarine because of pressure. So this brought me then to the story of the somewhat interesting and infamous story of the U-1206, one of the later submarines in the war. And just before the end of the Second World War, she was on patrol near the coast of Scotland, and she was submerged at about 60 meters when her captain decided that he needed to go to the toilet. And he figured that he was qualified to operate said toilet, which he probably wasn't. Because what happened is that it didn't work quite as he thought it would, and it flushed inwards. Which, besides being absolutely gross, caused further problems, because the water that went into the submarine, which is already a bad thing, started getting to the batteries and reacting with the batteries and causing poisonous gas to be developed inside the submarine. So he had no choice but to actually surface the thing, at which point he was immediately detected by the British and bombed from the air. So they decided to scuttle the submarine and make their way with little boats to the coast of Scotland. A couple of people died during that incident, and all because the captain thought he was very good at flushing the toilet. So that was interesting. But back to the model. So I've got the I don't know what you call them. Could you call them propeller shafts? Because they're not really propellers, are they? They're screws. I mean, at least that's what we call them in German. I don't actually know what's the English term for it. I think they're also screws called in English. So these things are super tiny and fragile, and I actually had a bit of a problem with some, I think you call it flushing, when some of the plastic goes in between the gaps in the mold of the original model. So I had to file quite a bit on these things and to see that I can actually get them glued into there. Then here we are with both of the propeller shafts on. They had to kind of meet in the middle there, so that was a bit fiddly. And at the end of the day, I do like using toothpicks for this sort of work and tweezers. Just wooden toothpicks are just really, I don't know. I find them they're really good tools for this sort of fine work of arranging things and getting things into the right places. But fingers at the end of the day will do the job as well. But yeah, the toothpicks also, they don't tend to not to get stuck on glue. So there we go. The two screw shafts. Don't know what you call them, but these things. And next we actually get to get the screws themselves. Now they were supposed to be painted in a brass color, I've got something that's reasonably close to brass, and since these are the only things on the whole submarine that get this color scheme, I'm not going to bother and get the exact color because I think it's pretty close. I think it's more of a golden tint than a brass tint, but really it's close enough. So I'm not going to get a different color just for these things. So I'm just going to give these a single coat because I don't want them like super shiny, because I want to get the whole thing a little bit of a used look in the end. So I don't really I'm happy with some of the gray shining through, and just generally getting them a little bit more grimy. And after they're dry, it's just a matter of cutting them out and not losing them. That's the problem with these really tiny models. You have a lot of small parts, and if they fall down onto the carpet, you have a problem. So I've had that a couple of times. But the screws are safe, and there they are. Tiny little screws. So I'm going to get these onto the little nubs on the shafts. And then again back to the useful toothpick, just to get them aligned and to make sure that the tips of the screws align well with the shafts, so they're not kind of slanting or anything. And there we have it. Screws on a submarine. All right, next part, and that's why I actually needed to make sure that the paint job is fine, because I'm pretty sure I can't easily get in there anymore afterwards. The rear hydroplanes, which go over the screws. So I'm just really going to fit these in, see if there's any filing I need to do. I always test fit before I glue in. Sometimes, especially with smaller components, they're not perfectly fitting. So once that's all asserted, then glue on. And I'm just going to fit these on with my hands and see that I get them in the right position. I get everything aligned, make sure they're not like hanging lower on one side or the other. And that's a nice little set. Now there's still some form of cage that goes over this in the end. But I just wanted to make sure, I need to let this dry first before I start putting anything more onto it, such that it doesn't fall off. So I'm going to let this dry for next time, and then we can still fit that cage thing over it, and work on the turret next, I think. So that's going to be interesting. And also this thing still gets a deck gun, I think. So well, all interesting stuff, and more stories and rabbit holes for me to go into. Anyway, that's it for today. Thanks everybody, have a good weekend, and I'll see you back next week with more World of Warships. Until then, bye bye.